morning. So, without further ado, distinguished guests, on behalf of the Faculty of Political Science and the Center for Social Development Studies of Chulalongkorn University, I'm very pleased to offer some brief welcoming remarks to this book launch and discussion on Unpacking the Water, Food, Energy Nexus in Asia, Power Politics, and Justice. So I'd like to warmly welcome the presenters and participants to the Faculty of Political Science of Chulalongkorn University today. I'd like to thank in particular Deepak who has traveled from Bangkok to join us today, and unfortunately Jeremiah who is supposed to join us from the UK as a family emergency, so she can't be with us today. It's a pleasure to see this book launch at Chulalongkorn University, which has emerged from an earlier project led by the Social Technology and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability Centers, or STEP Center, with which the Center for Social Development Studies and this faculty collaborated. The starting point of today's discussion is that the production, distribution, and consumption of food, energy, and water is generally in a complex and often contested trade-off relationship. For example, water infrastructure projects and the policies to support them are intended to increase food production while integrated agriculture that generates electricity through hydropower dams. Yet, they can also have unintended economic, social, and cultural consequences for existing resource users. Major decisions around food, water, and energy infrastructure can become highly political, especially when affected people struggle to have their voice heard in decisions. Institutional challenges also exist, including coordination amongst agencies responsible for food, energy, and water, and the creation and use of knowledge that can account for the dynamic properties and associated uncertainties of ecosystems in society. Over the last decade, the concept of the water, energy, food nexus has emerged as an increasingly prominent global policy, governance, and as well as research agenda. There's now much discussion about the nexus in global policy forums, yet it is often seen principally as a technical matter addressing issues of risk, security, and economies. However, the authors of the book to be presented today hope to show that at the very heart of the nexus arise questions about resource politics, ethics, and most importantly, justice. The Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University is very honored indeed to host this book launch today, and I hope that it will evoke and engage interdisciplinary debate on the implications for natural resource policy in Thailand, Asia, and beyond. Thank you very much. Now I think we'll begin the first session of the book launch, where we'll have two speakers giving an overview of the book. I'm very pleased to introduce you again, Dr. Deepak from Nepal Academy of Science and Technology. Dr. Deepak is currently the academician of the Nepal Academy of Science and Technology. His diverse training includes an hydroelectric power engineer at the Moscow Energy Institute, among other things, and a cultural theorist working with married couples to explain resource conflicts. He was Nepal's Minister of Water Resources from 2000 to 2003 and is chair of the non-profit Nepal Water Conservation Foundation. So I believe she's in a very good position to give us the overview today. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me introduce this book. It grew out of a set of discussions actually in Sussex with under the Institute for Development Studies research work called Pathways to Sustainability. The trouble with sustainability, and we quickly found out that Nexus has something similar, is that it can very easily be stuck in some kind of static understanding of what sustainability is. So Sussex has been pushing for this dynamic sustainability idea, and this is where the idea of exploring the Nexus began. And as we were looking around, who could be good partners, and we found Carl here in Chulalongkorn. So that's how our partnership started quite some time back. And we've been working on this book for quite a number of years. I've forgotten how many by now, the number of drafts. Now, it's this book is actually, it's got 8 chapters, of which 6 are core in terms of critique, in terms of institutions, knowledge, governance, rights, ethics. Now, these are things you generally don't associate when you talk about things like integrated development and Nexus and all. Now, how did this, I'll go into the sort of the broad philosophical basis from where we began this exploration. One of them was definitely this fear we had. The predecessor to the Nexus is integrated water resource management. And seeing what happened to it, how it was hijacked, began this exploration. And ultimately completely one of them was definitely that fear we had. Again, is the predecessor to the Nexus, broader approach than integrated water. And will the same fate befall the Nexus? So that's how we started exploring. And we came to the conclusion that definitely that fear we had, again, is the predecessor to the Nexus, broader approach than integrated water. And will the same fate much more than public-private partnership. The trouble with public-private partnership is that the public often gets subsumed completely under private and loses all basis in this age of so-called globalization. And the other approach, other issue was, so we argue for public-private civic partnership. That civic voice is missing in most of the debates that we've had in the past. And it's one of the reasons why the IWRM kind of got lost along the way. And finally, this approach, the way we look at it, tries to, we argue that it has to internalize 3 kinds of different politics. Nexus is a very political thing. And to ignore the politics is to make it amenable to easy hijack by kind of hegemonic interests. So there are 3 types of politics. The politics of inequality, the politics of knowledge, where there is hegemonic knowledge that steamrollers every other types of knowledge. And then finally geopolitics. That we've got to realize that there is something going on in geopolitics, and I'm sure now you will agree in the age of Trump that yes, it's important. That lends the whole concept to some kind of hegemonic hijack. So with these, this is where we are broadly focused around trying to, in this book, address the issue of Nexus, and if Nexus is going to be a good idea in the future for development activities, then these are the kind of issues that will not have an easy answer, but definitely need to be acknowledged and openly discussed and debated. So this was the basically.
I think Deepak was quite polite when he said that we've been working on the book a long time and we are kind of behind deadline a bit as well. So unfortunately, Jeremy, who would be talking about this chapter, had a family emergency, and so he cannot join us. He was planning to join us by Skype, so I'm going to step in. I'll try and do it justice, but this is kind of more of his expertise. So one of the things that we're interested in this book, which I think is also quite central to this sort of steps approach, is the power of discourse and the power of ideas. And in particular, where do ideas come from? And how do they kind of propagate particular values? And as we'll discuss later, particular ethics as well. So the first part of the book, which is probably the longest chapter, was looking at the origin of where this Nexus idea came from. And as Deepak already mentioned, there's a longer history of integration. So like the Nexus as an integrative idea is not new. There are other efforts at integration. Even before integrated water resources management, there have been other ideas of how to link together different sectors. So what was new about the Nexus is kind of an important question. So when we started looking at the origin of the Nexus as an idea, we found that it started to, the particular formulation that is now quite common in global policy circles, originated around 2007 and 2008, which was the time of the global food and energy price shocks. And so the Nexus, we found, was started to be discussed in the World Economic Forum, which is an interesting venue, given that you're often more associated with CEOs and prime ministers more concerned with economic growth. But increasingly, the World Economic Forum has paid greater attention to the ecological foundations of economic growth. So water scarcity in particular has started to gain attention as something that is a genuine threat to economic growth globally. So the World Economic Forum has become increasingly interested in how to govern water, but then also other related economic systems, so the food systems and the energy systems that are also very central to economic growth. When we started the World Economic Forum becoming more economically interested in how to govern agriculture, we started to see that it was related to scarcity systems. So there's not enough of these resources, the energy systems that are also very central to economic growth. In one sense, I guess it is, when we started the World Economic Forum becoming more economically interested in how to govern agriculture, we started to see that it was related to scarcity systems energy, and that would suggest that there's a scarcity. But then, if we think back to 2007, 2008, there have been different explanations as to why those prices increased that range from like the rising price of oil that increased the price of food, to weather-related poor harvests, to speculation in global financial markets. So it's not one straightforward explanation. But I think what was particularly interesting for us was the response. Scarcity can be converted into securitization, i.e. when there's a shortage of something, it can be turned into a threat. And a threat can be turned into something that requires a particular form of response so that things are safe again. And we could see this narrative emerging around the World Economic Forum's interpretation of the Nexus. So at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2008, the former World Bank President Robert Zoellick argued that the increased food prices and their threat matter not only to people but also to political stability, and therefore it's an urgent issue that needs immediate attention. John Beddington, who was the chief scientific advisor to the British government, referred to the perfect storm, again kind of evoking a sense of something impending that was not going to be good for society. So in the book, the idea is not to give great detail of the whole book. You can read it, there are some books here. But we're in the library, it's really good to see so many students here, so you can get it in the library or you can borrow a copy from me. What we're then interested in, like, as this narrative builds, how does it then create a response? And one thing that we mapped in the book is how the idea propagated through different international organizations, different international forums, the role of bilateral donors, the role of the UN, and the role of transnational corporations under the World Economic Forum, or through the World Economic Forum. And one thing that we could pick out was that there was relatively little discussion about dealing with supply side. So in other words, there was discussion about making things more efficient, but that's not the same as fundamentally questioning about demand in the first place and why we use so much resources. And maybe this is not so surprising because to reduce demand would be to reduce economic growth in a sense, and that's probably not in the interest of many members of the World Economic Forum. So rather, the response was along the lines of like basically technology-driven approaches, things like sustainable intensification. So how can we produce more from less, but at the same time keep on producing more? So the idea would then be that we can keep on producing, but we reduce the pressure on the environment at the same time. But especially when applied to agriculture, this particular modality of production fits in quite nicely with a modernization agenda. So high-tech agriculture with high input. What that translates to is a particular form of agriculture. It's not generally supporting smallholders, it's leading to large farms and large-scale production. And again, this is quite aligned with the approach of the World Economic Forum in the way that it thinks that our food system should be organized. And then, so in the book, we detail in greater depth how that gained momentum. Different research groups were formed, the task force, reports were produced, and so on. Another interesting dimension that I think relates more to recent critique in social science is how the World Economic Forum's approach links to the idea of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is quite an interesting concept in the sense that it's kind of a word that gives a marker that humans now shape the planet at a planetary scale. So we no longer live within a planet that humans cannot really shape at the highest level the fundamental systems. And probably the idea that the phenomenon that would come straight to your mind is climate change. Right? Like humans are changing the climate at a global scale. So in the Anthropocene, there's a whole body of knowledge now being produced, which is probably kind of like a systems approach, like understanding socio-ecological systems, where we can kind of quantify human flows of resources and the activities that we do. One particularly prominent idea has been Rostrom's idea of planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries is a concept that says that there are certain thresholds beyond which we should not exceed, otherwise catastrophe awaits us beyond them. So this kind of, again, creates a sense of limits to growth that has a long history in social science. So the big debates about whether humans have the ingenuity to keep on reworking our approach to production, or whether there are fundamental limits beyond which society cannot expand. Now, I think it's intuitively it makes sense, and this is like in the book, like it makes sense. Oh, we've lost in the book we discuss about how. Okay, sorry, I see it, but you don't. And in the book we discuss how like this debate fits into big questions about the politics of the response that is needed to this planetary crisis. So if there are limits to growth, whether planetary boundaries are other ways understood, actually this then raises questions about what should we do, what should people do, and it therefore raises questions about the distribution of resources. And when we think about the nexus, like the allocation of resources, the scarcity of food, water, and energy, actually this becomes a question of allocation. So we want to sort of link the idea of the nexus into these big debates. But at the same time, we're a little bit cautious on the idea of the Anthropocene because it tends to be quite dominated by scientific knowledge that can tend to serve particular agendas. And recently there's been more discussion about the concept called the capitalocene, which recognizes that really the Anthropocene is actually capitalism at large. And so it's better to understand it as capitalism rather than just understanding it as human interaction with the environment. Okay, so the World Economic Forum basically developed this idea that we have to have a response because there are limits to growth, and we need to start looking at the way that we produce food, water, and energy. A second approach was kind of more developed through donor-led initiatives, and it related to the Earth Summit, Rio Plus 20 Earth Summit in 2012. So this was led, it was led by Germany, and it had a lot of international organizations involved. And it kind of led more to the sustainability agenda that now feeds into the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that this approach does pay more attention to the issue of poverty reduction and marginalization. We can see that in the way that it's being researched and written. But at the same time, at the very core, it still reflects the idea of a green economy, that modernization is the main approach towards dealing with these contradictions. So I'm going to change this. I have to apologize. Let me just change over the computers. Or maybe I'll just keep on talking. So, yeah. 1 second, sorry. Okay, we have to continue. Okay, I see on my screen. I think we'll just continue without the PowerPoint. You'll have to look at me, I'm afraid. The PowerPoint pictures are nicer, but I'm afraid I'll have to carry it. Okay, so in the book we then try and get a sense of the gaining momentum around the Nexus as an idea. So from the origins in 2008 in the World Economic Forum, and then in 2012 at Rio Plus 20, we then showed how other events like World Water Day started to also talk about the Nexus. So in a Sustainable Development Goals report in 2017, a UN publication notes that the most commonly discussed set of interactions amongst the SDGs are the nexus between food, water and energy, as reflected in the links between SDG 2 on food, SDG 6 on water, and SDG 7 on energy, and they note that there's a potential for conflict. In the book, we also detail how the nexus disseminated around Southeast Asia. So we made an effort to document the meetings and the organizations. So one of the similarities between the two approaches is that they both take a systems approach. So they essentially take a particular approach to social science that tries to measure like flows of resources. They engage with institutions, but less so with the underlying issues of like justice and ethics and politics. So we try and position the book more in the field of political ecology than the systems approach. And one thing that we're particularly interested in is how this Nexus literature starts to talk about the issue of distribution and how it's going to approach the trade-off decisions. So, as I said, but this is to emphasize things not on the screen, at the very core of the Nexus is the idea of trade-offs. What we're interested in this book is how those trade-offs are made, how are the decisions taken around the trade-offs, who's included, who's excluded, whose interests are served. And I think this is, so in the basis of this book is to pay more attention to attaining poverty reduction goals and how food, water and energy is secured, but secured for who? How is it prioritized? A second reason for the book was, as Deepak mentioned, the idea that we want to look at dynamic sustainability. So this is a more recent recognition that comes from the work at the STEP Center that emphasizes that nature is not totally under the control of people. There are limits to which humans can control nature. And so this kind of idea of limits challenges conventional engineering thinking about how to manage water and other resources. So in this book, we try and explore the idea of the nexus through a more dynamic sense, recognizing these limits to control, and then thinking about what types of responses are more appropriate. So in other words, not just technological solutions, but also thinking about social responses and social processes. The final point that we pick up upon is the role of knowledge and knowledge production. And we'll come back to this later, but a lot of the early work on the Nexus has emphasized expert knowledge. There have been more recent efforts, including in this region, to have more participatory approaches, but still it's primarily an expert form of knowledge. So in the book we explore how might we undertake transdisciplinary approaches to thinking about the Nexus. Okay, so now I come back to the
One of the key issues we have in the book is with interdisciplinarity. Now, it's a term very often bandied about, but very difficult in practice to see it practiced. And first we've got to distinguish between what is multidisciplinarity and what is interdisciplinarity. Then interdisciplinarity gets transformed into transdisciplinarity and all sorts of other boring sort of things. But a key issue there is that multidiscipline means you get people of different disciplines, get them to sit around the table, and address that slice of the problem that is amenable to their tools. An economist would address it as an economist, and a geologist as a geologist, or political scientist as a political science tools, But then who puts it together? And the assumption is that some decision maker will put it together. Now you know what a decision maker is. Well, I've been involved in as a minister, but by accident, an academic. But generally, to expect that a minister has all the wherewithals to synthesize it all and put it together is probably asking a bit too much. That the academic community cannot shy away from that responsibility of actually putting things together. So this is where interdisciplinarity comes. And interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, I won't get into too much of that difference. But essentially, to me, it is about listening to the concerns of other disciplines and then modifying how one's own discipline defines the problem. So we see this in water resources and the conflicts around dams all the time. You have engineering solutions proposed, and then even economists disagree sometimes with that. And then you have social scientists and anthropologists who disagree even more. Okay. So the question is there some transdisciplinarity where engineers can start thinking like anthropologists, and anthropologists can understand things that economists are saying? So this is where we basically come with this idea of the nexus, having to tackle the question of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. Unless our own thinking is nexus, we are not going to get nexus on the ground out there. So the approach actually is, nexus is properly done, is more democratic in the sense that it takes up this Karl Popperin idea of falsification, in the sense that scientists are not supposed to say we are right, I am right. Scientists are supposed to say, prove me wrong. So that's the core idea. It demands a certain amount of egalitarianism, which means counterbalancing the biases of privilege. There is certain knowledge that is privileged, and it has to be countered all the time. Similarly, there's a demand of humility among academics and scientists. Again, the idea is not to say I am right, but to say that at least for the time being, until I am proved wrong, maybe what I say is right. So please prove me wrong. So there's a degree of humility that has to be inbuilt to create that kind of space for other contested understandings that are out there, and not try to suppress them, which is where most of our policy making tends to go towards. Okay? Then the whole idea of pluralism, that the ethics of tolerance for other values, we don't see that very often. Okay? And Nexus demands that this kind of pluralism be built into our kind of planning and thinking and so on. And finally, this idea of reflexibility. Now, reflexibility is maybe easy to define, but very difficult to practice. That is to be able to distance yourself from handed down wisdom or your biases and everything that you've come to study and understand, and then to be able to critique and question, to interrogate. Now that means stepping out of the comfort zone of your skin. And those of us who've been sort of in policy battles around water, energy, and so on, we notice very well that wherever there has been a successful quote-unquote nexus understanding of the problem, these four things are found. And these four things will help come to not the originally proposed solution, but some kind of a modification where each one of those doing the contesting from a very different perspective would get something that is far less than what they wanted originally. An engineer designing a dam would have wanted one of these lovely big structures. But maybe at the end of it they get a dam, but maybe it's one with a smaller height or less submergence, a bit more cost added because people have to be taken care of to get displaced. These concerns don't come in the original engineering design of dams. They are forced on and resisted equally, and with a tendency to bulldoze that solution right through and help whoever is on the way. So with these four things, we found out that unless we get into this transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, Nexus will again be hijacked hijacked by one of the more hegemonic of disciplines. In the case of water and energy and food, it has always been mostly bad civil engineering and even worse liberal economics. So there is a need to go beyond that, and this is where we argue in our book that this is where we come about the Nexus. Now, together with that is the concept. You see the diagram? Yeah. So this question of governance. So essentially, the question of before Nexus governance is to posit itself opposed to silo govern mentality. The idea that governing means controlling everything and pushing the solutions. No, it's more about accepting what the other views are and trying to accommodate all that. So within this, there are we recognize in our book that we argue that there are multiple nexuses. Right now we're talking about water, energy, food because in 2008 that's what happened. A Tunisian guy with a loaf of bread brought about that whole Arab, uprising. Okay? Because food was critical to that, energy was critical to that, and so was water. Now, what we are finding out is that there are other points of nexuses that are equally important that come about, and the two that come immediately to mind is the whole issue of transportation, for instance. How do you transport things with renewable energy or with fossil fuel more and more? Okay. The big debate in South Asia, Nepal and India, is Mr. Modi's, or rather Mr. Nitin Gadkari's ministers' proposal for river navigation. This has put most of us, environmentalists and all that, in a very difficult position because this is first of all far better than the current policy of sucking the river dry and filling it back with seawater. Okay? Because if you have navigation, you've got to have water in the river. And more water than E-flow would allow. The N-flow would be several times more than E-flow. So it brings about a political possibility of association with other interests that has not been there before. E-flow has no political interest behind it. Rather, no political traction behind it with the powers that be. Okay? And so there is a scope for that. But at the same time, navigation will also involve dredging and building all kinds of things and locks and all that most environmentalists don't like. So before much of the environmental movement in India now is this very difficult task. Now, how do we address river navigation? We know how to fight the irrigation mafia. We know how to fight the hydropower mafia. Now, what do we do about this new thing? So this is where a nexus governance kind of idea becomes extremely important. Storage is another one. Have we ever bothered to think about different types of food storage technologies, different types of water storages? IMI is quite famous for talking about 4 different types of storages, not just the storage behind cement dams, which only benefits downstream, not upstream, but also storage through rainwater harvesting, storage in groundwater, through recharge and through wetlands and all that. So the moment you make the terrain more multiple, then you find out, same with food. There have been traditional storage technologies of food, but now with all this packaged food, what is very incongruous in Nepal, for instance, where you have to walk 3 days to reach a village from the nearest road, you find out that the government of Nepal cannot even bring textbooks to schools there. But then you have these sellers of packaged Wai-Wais and chow mein or whatever reaching that place, and you can get it there even though you can't get school textbooks. So storage technology allows all kinds of things to happen, but have we really deconstructed that and begun to address that, for instance, together with water, energy, and food? The other issue that we have in governance is this whole idea of innovation. Now, innovation is, I Google it and we found something like 7 million hits you can get on innovation. Innovation this, innovation institute, innovation all of it, okay? But then what is forgotten is that innovations mostly are defined as technical innovations. These very fancy iPads and all sorts of things. But those are technical innovations that markets are good at. If you look at this policy stool over there, the 3-legged stool of bureaucratic hierarchism and governments over there, you have market individualism, and you have activist egalitarians. And you find out that technology is on that left leg of the stool, where the iPhones and iPads and all sorts of these fancy things reinvented all the time. The trouble is, unless you simultaneously have behavioral innovation, and that happens in the egalitarian end because that's where values come in. And the other one is mostly profit. And profit is a powerful driving motive. But then so is value changes and value resistance that's there. But that's the area where egalitarians are most active in talking about values of social justice and all sorts of things. And then to tie up all this, you've got to have the management innovations in the bureaucratic hierarchism level. In Nepal, for instance, what we are finding out is we are trying to manage, all this dynamics of the market, especially with BRI and God knows what else with the Chinese, just north of us. And we're trying to manage all that kind of modern technology, modern kind of things with laws that actually go back 100 or 200 years with no change. The same in India, for instance. Much of the problem in India is coming about because the laws that are supposed to handle some of these behavioral and other changes date back to 1824 British laws, unchanged so far. Okay. So this is where you need multiple innovations, and multiple innovations also come, and this is what we mean by Nexus governance, that you really have to address all these three things simultaneously before you can get a good Nexus governance solution.
So in the second half of the book, like Deepak has been talking a lot about the different values, and I think the core idea of the cultural theory is to recognize the kind of plural values and plural ethics that are involved around resources in our particular case. So the second half of the book then talks more about Nexus and justice, and Nexus and ethics. So we'll take them one at a time. In the first part, we talk about Nexus rights and justice. So this isn't found so much in the current Nexus literature. There's a lot of discussion about distribution. There's a lot of discussion about how resources should be allocated, but at the very core of all public policy are values. So our argument in the second half of the book is that we should have a more explicit discussion about the values at the heart of policies, not just how things should be divided up. And it's a subtle but very important difference, because if you take the entry point as a value discussion, then you build policy upwards from there, rather than saying, oh, you get 40%, you get 60%, some of the discussion in that way, or building scenarios. So the argument here is that by rendering more visible ethics and justice, we can have a more satisfactory outcome at the end. But there's a little bit of a twist that I come to later, which is a twist that is based around the risk of universalism. So an assumption that we all hold the same perspective on the world. Now, this is incredibly relevant to a region like Southeast Asia, and I think South Asia as well. In fact, probably every region where you have different indigenous groups or different cultures interacting with each other. Does everybody see reality the same way? In other words, like when I say water, do you see water the same as me? Actually, from our perspective, water is far more socially embedded. It has different values depending upon which relationships it's in. So, in that sense, talking about ethics and justice, we actually need to talk about plural values and plural ethics. So, we started by thinking about this in terms of rights. So in the chapter on Nexus rights and justice, what we try and argue is that the Nexus concept must more clearly engage with promoting fair decision-making and just outcomes. So, in other words, talking more about justice first and foremost. In this chapter, we drew on environmental justice literature in particular as a way to approach this. So, one of the important things about environmental justice literature is that it's both analytical and normative. So, we can have an analysis of who gets what. But to understand whether it's fair or not, we need to talk with people. So we need to actually understand whether something's considered fair from the perspective of the people involved in the distribution. So in environmental justice literature, it talks about distributive justice, the allocation of goods and bads, risks, procedural justice, how was the decisions taken, and then justice as recognition, like what's valued and what is not valued. And this is very much related to the politics of knowledge. I think one thing that we found interesting is if you look at the individual sectors, food, water, energy, there's quite vibrant discussions around each about justice, like food justice, water justice, energy justice. But you don't really see them interact so much, neither in the Nexus literature or amongst themselves. So, for example, when we talk about food justice, there's grassroots movements like Via Campesina, and there's also more institutional approaches like UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Different concepts of food justice have emerged, such as food sovereignty and land sovereignty, for example. Regarding water, there's a movement around the right to water, for example. There's also a large movement around like the idea of water grabbing. And then also around energy, there's different ways of thinking about energy justice. Like one sort of narrative is that we have to have national energy security. But actually that doesn't talk about distribution of energy within a country. So in other words, having national energy security doesn't necessarily talk about the distribution of who uses energy in the country. So in other words, national energy security could be channeled towards economic growth, or it could be channeled towards distributing to meet rural energy demands. So these are different forms of energy. Our interest, I think, is how to bring these together. We don't have a full solution yet, but one observation that we had was that human rights are independent and indivisible. So one potential approach to bring these different forms of justice together is to talk about it in the context of human rights. Maybe this could be the normative framework that anchors everything together. So on the one hand, definitely we cannot survive without water and food, and they are recognized as individual human rights. Arguably, energy enables us to fulfill many other forms of rights. So we could see these as positive human rights, where like the right to water, the right to food, the benefit from energy enables us to have well-being and to fulfill our rights. There has been a growing momentum in the human rights community around the right to the environment, where many of these things come together. So this UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, John Knott, concluded in March 2014 that he believed it was now beyond argument that human rights law includes the obligation to the right to the environment, a clean, healthy and safe environment. So in the book we provide an example of the Mekong mainstream dams in mainland Southeast Asia, on the Mekong, which also draws upon a bigger, more complete paper that I co-authored with Ashley Pritchard, where we show how the human rights institutions and the human rights system in Southeast Asia offered a number of different arenas through which different aspects of the right to food, the right to water, the right to livelihood, that links together different nexus concerns could be discussed in the same venue. So I'm not going to go into this in detail unless you want to ask questions about it. In the end, so it also brings together other ideas around extraterritorial obligations, so human rights beyond borders as well. So Thailand's National Human Rights Commission was involved in investigating cases across borders, which is quite unconventional for a National Human Rights Commission, but increasingly necessary in an interconnected region. So in the case study, on the screen here that we have the different examples of human rights arenas where the right to food, the right to water could be brought together in a more holistic sense, in a nexus sense. The other side of this that is very much related to justice is the idea of ethics. So as I said, humans cannot survive without water, food, and arguably energy. So in other words, ethics is concerned with value. And how do we attribute value? So on the one hand, water has a value. You can go to 7-Eleven and buy water at a very cheap rate, like maybe 10 baht a bottle. But does that really convey the value of water? You cannot live without water, so really water is also life in a sense. So there are different forms, there are different ways that we can connote the value of water. And so the last chapter of the book, before the conclusion, is basically talking about ethics, like the ethics of the food, water, energy nexus. Our argument here is that a nexus approach, if it's talking about decision making and distribution, of value judgments. And therefore, it's important to acknowledge that value judgments are being made. And our argument is that we need to render more visible the contesting values. To make visible contesting values is not to resolve them. Often there are dilemmas involved. Dilemmas meaning that there's no optimal outcome that everyone will be happy. So in other words, there has to be a clear decision-making process to make these values discussed and then decided upon. And I think, again, I feel a bit sad that we've organised this on the same day as a very important meeting with the Mekong River Commission. The MRC has to engage in this all the time. When governments interact around sharing the Mekong River, at the one hand it engages at a technical level, the allocation of water, the allocation of risk, but also underlying all that is a question of values. Like, what are the principles, what are the values around which water should be shared between countries? And inevitably, these discussions do not take place in a vacuum. They take place within a context of politics where some actors have more power than others, and therefore can marginalize some values in order to further their own values as the dominant ones. I think the other thing that's been quite important to us in this book is to recognize that there's a growing, actually I would say a growing recognition, in a Western ethics sense, a growing recognition of the need to shift from anthropocentric to non-anthropocentric approaches to ethics. So in other words, to recognize that humans alone are not the single most important species on the planet. So many religious approaches, maybe apart from Western Christianity, have already largely recognized this. So in the book we have a discussion on religion, value, and the nexus, that I won't go into in detail here. Okay, I'll keep on going. So we can identify different ethics systems around energy. There are papers that are now being published on it. So, for example, one paper by Chulalongkorn in 2015 identified 8 different ethics factors for distributors talking about energy justice: availability, affordability, due process, good governance, sustainability, intergenerational equity, and responsibility. Similarly, for food, we can find a whole different range of ethical discussions. So, for example, about genetically modified organisms and the way like should we be modifying organisms. Is it okay or not to raise animals for human consumption in caged conditions, which is kind of the very basis of the way that meat production is secured. And then also regarding water, UNESCO has had a long-term project on the ethics of water since 1997 that has explored in a very holistic way the different ethics of water. So I won't go into these in detail in the interest of time, but we see a strong foundation existing to actually have this discussion of the nexus ethics, not just by water, food, and energy. The other important thing then is how to move from anthropocentric to non-anthropocentric. So even within anthropocentric approaches, probably one of the main approaches is the idea of utilitarianism. So we can have market utilitarianism, basically things are distributed according to market principles. We can have bureaucratic utilitarianism, where state-led processes govern the distribution for the greatest good. So utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number. But within this, there's kind of a lot of other ethical issues. So for example, it's commonly pointed out that you could have a tyranny of the majority against the minority when we talk about a utilitarian approach. So in a liberal sense, normally we would accompany utilitarianism with a rights-based approach so that nobody is unfairly discriminated against as an individual, even as there's the greatest good for the greatest number. But these are very much anthropocentric approaches. More recently, there's been innovations around how to bring non-human life into our ethical system. And I think, in terms of the survival of the human species, we cannot not talk about this anymore. So one approach is to extend the moral standing of non-human life from humans. So for example, animal rights could work that way. Could be something more holistic, that is maybe more conducive to the way that we might want to think about the nexus in a transdisciplinary sense. So the well-known American writer Aldo Leopold talked about the land ethic. So the land ethic from Leopold's famous essay talks about how a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. But what he's trying to do is to say that it's not just individuals within a landscape, it's the landscape itself and the interaction with many different species that sustain that landscape that's important ethically. And then more recently there's also been discussions about extending the human rights framework to incorporate more than human things. So for example, the recent recognition in New Zealand of a river that was given legal personhood. So these are quite contested things in terms of legal approaches, but it's starting to happen. So we need to start really examining our ethical principles on which law is based and how we could bring more nexus together. So to wrap up, to bring some conclusions, what we try to emphasize in the book is the need to democratize the nexus. We see that at the moment a lot of the nexus framing in the literature, the way it's written about, emphasizes around technology, mass production, and particularly around environmental economic models that emphasize efficiency and trade-off. It's useful, it's moving forward, but it's not enough. Our argument is that we need more. We need to talk more about the ethics, the justice, the transdisciplinary approaches. So we have 4 concluding points. The first is that the nexus is a contested discourse. We need to see the nexus as a discourse, not as just an idea that is a universal truth. So some of the dominant discourses have been the one coming from the World Economic Forum and the one also coming from Rio +20 and the green economy. And we're asking how can we move beyond these 2 discourses alone. The second is thinking about things from a political economic perspective. To us it's still not clear where is the entry point when we talk about water, food, and energy systems. Actually, the evolution from integrated water resources management to the nexus was trying to address the perception amongst different resource managers and researchers that water was in the lead. So in other words, in integrated water resources management, water was seen as the lead, and so those more involved in food and energy couldn't easily see their place. So the nexus was to address that, but it seems very much to us that it's still largely led by water. So how can we move beyond this approach? One of the challenges we think is that especially food and energy have very different political economic systems with different sets of actors within them. So it's quite challenging. We don't have the solution to this fully, but to recognize that there's going to have to be more reconciling of different actors with different rationalities in the systems. The third issue is around scale and power. We see a lot of the nexus literature at the moment is very much top-down. It has participation, but it's very much led by top-down expertise. We wonder how we can invert this. And I think this then leads to the 4th point around the transdisciplinary approach. How to genuinely engage in transdisciplinary research to really learn interacting from experts in sciences and social science with experts who are resource managers, local farmers, local officials, and so on. So what we hope through publishing this book is that we can try and reframe the nexus a bit away from just talking about it in technical terms. Because issues of distribution at the heart, we think that issues of justice and ethics really need to be discussed more by those that are involved in the more technical parts, so that we can actually have a nexus that everyone can engage in and rethink. So I'll stop there and thank you very much on behalf of both of us for your attention, and we look forward to your feedback.
Thank you very much, Dr. Deepak and Carl. Next, we have 2 discussants. We have great pleasure to welcome Dr. Takeshi Ito from Sophia University. Dr. Ito also is spending some time as research fellow at the Center for Social and Development Studies of Chulalongkorn University here. And also Dr. Suphawadi Setnoy from Chulalongkorn University School of Agricultural Resources. So we'll have Dr. Ito first, and each discussant will have around 10 minutes to provide some thoughts.
Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations to Jeremy, Carl, and Deepak for the publication of the book. And reading the book really illustrated some of the things that I have also struggled to make sense based on my own research, and not necessarily that I have any solutions to the the points that also the book is trying to expand on. What I'd like to do here is to sort of first flesh out some of the main points of the book and also go into 3 points that I'd like to sort of stimulate some discussions from the authors and also from the audience. This book makes an important contribution to the new literature on the water and energy nexus. It comprehensively covers important topics associated with the nexus, such as a short history and critique of nexus thinking, epistemology and methodology of nexus thinking, including transdisciplinary approaches to water, and environmental justice and ethics. The book sets out the context of nexus thinking at the convergence of climate, financial, food, and energy crises in 2007 and 2008. Against this backdrop, the World Economic Forum began to develop water, food, energy nexus to promote integrated approaches to natural resource management across sectors, national boundaries, administrative developments, and academic disciplines. However, the private sector led by WEF misrepresented and oversimplified the underlying problem of the multiple crises, framing it as global scarcity of key resources such as water, food, and energy. The framing of the underlying problem suggests efficiency across the interconnected sectors, water, food, and energy, as a solution for the crises. This framing skillfully leaves out political economic perspective on access to natural resources that are mediated by social relations. The authors write, I quote from page 9, nexus thinking should be used to highlight linkages between local resources, livelihoods, and rights and social justice, not just between sectors such as food, water, energy, and not just with the compatible tools available within them. Power, politics, and justice, as reflected in the title of the book, are the key barriers and entry points for governing the nexus that demands the generation of new and uncomfortable knowledge as well as tools more amenable to analyzing political trade-offs. End quote. The main critique of the nexus is that it uncritically identifies global water scarcity as the underlying problem of the conversion of multiple crises. The framing of the problem justifies the nexus focus on resource management based on the supremacy of science and technology over which businesses and governments enjoy comparative advantage. A major problem with thinking, as the book rightly suggests, is the lack of political economic perspectives. Who gains which resources, how much, why, and with what implications? Securing access to water, food, and energy is to reconcile the interests of various actors at multiple scales. In this sense, it is not technical, but political. Furthermore, it is not only about materiality, efficiency, and resource management for human society, but also about sustainability, rights, and justice for humans and non-humans. Natural resources should not be seen simply as inputs for economic development, but are embedded in both social and ecological relations. In this connection, I'd like to raise 3 points for the purpose of discussion. The first point is concerned with the application of the nexus in solving real-world problems of unequal access to resources. As the book shows, on the one hand, the nexus is very useful showing the sectoral interconnectedness among water, food, and energy. On the other hand, due to the corporate and government-initiated framing of the problem, the solutions are technically driven and necessarily managerial and compartmentalized. The book also acknowledges power relation as a formidable challenge for negotiating integrated and inclusive approaches and solutions. In the two case studies in Nepal, sorry for my pronunciation, Kulikani hydroelectric power stations and Mulamachi trans-basin water supply, the book ably shows who is excluded from the solutions with social and ecological implications. So So I'd like to hear from the authors about how governments, businesses, and civil society can sharpen the edge of Nexus thinking in solving real-world problems of unequal access to resources, which do not appear to be recognized in the first place. The second point is about the epistemology and methodology of the Nexus. As the book argues, Nexus thinking requires transdisciplinary approaches, government, market, civil society, as well as various academic disciplines. The authors write, quote from page 79, in normal mundane times, alternatively, one should strive to break silo thinking by letting plural voices be both heard and responded. End quote. In both pro sectors and academic disciplines, power relations influence whose voice matters more. In observing how science informs government policy and decision making, the relationship is not always linear. Science can be abused to promote certain policy. Furthermore, we need to recognize that knowledge production in academia is influenced by power relations, where a certain discipline has a larger say than others. Science and engineering can make concrete and immediate impacts on society, which can be seen, measured, and reported. In business and politics, entrepreneurs and politicians are driven by different scales of time and space than non-human actors in nature. For example, on one hand, corporations must make profits and report their profits every quarter and fiscal year, while politicians must achieve their campaign promises in 2 to 5 years. On the other hand, the life cycles of trees, fish, and birds range from 1 year to 40 to 50 years. In other words, scientific and technological breakthrough are expected to fill in temporal and spatial gaps. For this reason, science and engineering have enjoyed greater influence and close relations with business and governments. So another challenge for the Nexus is mainstreaming critical social science in the accumulation of knowledge and methodology. And I'd like to ask the authors to share with us your experiences of how knowledge production is translated into policy on the ground. The third point, which is my last, is about environmental justice. The book closes by discussing the importance of including environmental justice in the Nexus, and I 100% agree with the authors. This perspective is particularly important when nature is understood as primarily commodities or inputs for economic development and food and energy security. The authors write, I quote from page 98, environmental justice draws on concepts of distributional, procedural, and recognitional justice and emphasize an explicit consideration of power asymmetries and the politics of knowledge, end quote. Scholar activists have developed concepts such as food sovereignty, the right to water, the right to energy, to challenge business and government responses to the multiple crises. On the surface, social movements like these are making positive impacts on the inclusion of small-scale farmers, fishers, and displaced people in policy and decision making. Yet the Nexus faces challenge of expanding its scope to include the voices of people who have struggled to keep access to natural resources open. How can ordinary people participate in the Nexus? And can Nexus thinking be useful for rights-based activists to integrate their work along the water, food, energy Nexus? I think this is a point Carl was mentioning. Activism have worked in a bit of silo, and how to integrate these movements into sort of to orchestrate their voices along the Nexus. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you for having me here.
I'm Supuan from School of Agricultural Resources, Chulalongkorn University. I have to be frank, I haven't actually read this book, but my comments is basically based on your presentation today and I just from my quick scan. As my background, I study the value chain and also the extension, especially for the small-scale farmers. So maybe it would be beneficial if I share my recent experience because I just came back from a long research trip to Vietnam and China. And I totally agree with the author about the transdisciplinary research as the fundamental basis and background for a good policy. I think Dr. Powell mentioned about the policy right now needs to be bottom up, right? But from my experience, it still needs to be top down, but it needs a good feedback from bottom up research and studies. We went to Vietnam and China along the R12 road from Laos border up to Vietnam borders and through China. Our group consisted of different field of researchers, agriculture, economists, law, and also logistics professors. Because right now research and study, especially for policy, should be transdisciplinary because from our experience, it's not just about trades. It's also about politics and law, international laws. Our research are doing about the impact and effect of foreign traders, especially in the fruit trades, Thai fruit value chain. We study who gets the most benefits and how we improve the benefits and profits of our farmers and Thai entrepreneur, Thai trader, exporters, especially in durian fruit chain, the value chain for durians, because right now China is our number one market and now it's becoming a single market for durian exports. So I will not talk about in detail, but I just can give you a background of my research. So I'm not so sure if in your book talk about economics factor because we cannot rule out economic factor from human rights and ethics. We need to study about the effect of globalization, especially free trades, FTA, law, because it actually affects, because my background is agriculture, it actually affects our small-scale farmers a lot. Because have law of limitation, everything about exporting the fruits, and also to make things sustainable, it needs to be at least, I think, bring us 3 areas, right? Environment, economics, and also social. Especially for small-scale farmers, you cannot make them do things sustainably or conserve environment if they're not actually stable in terms of economics. So, because you mentioned on the page 21 about shortages could cause social and political instability. In this term of shortage, you mean like resource, right? But if you're going backward, there's a study about land degradation. Especially the cause of land degradation somehow came from economic problems. Because sometimes farmers, they need to rest the soil, the land a bit before the next crop, right? But in terms of economic pressure, sometimes that pressure them to do not to rotate the crop, but to do it continuously. So it loses the soil loses nutrients and organic substances, and it leads to land degradation and then leads to land shortages. So land shortage and resources shortages not just came from just the farmers itself, but also economic pressure, because that's also the economic pressure from the poverty of the farmers themselves. And what I mean by the globalization and free trades, when we talk about Southeast Asia, we're not talking about the 10 countries anymore. We have to look at the third parties, like superpower countries as well. For example, the China that I went to, because right now they have invested, especially in terms of farming and agriculture, in almost many countries in Southeast Asia already. They invested in Cambodia, Laos, and right now in Thailand as well, but maybe we haven't seen it. So if we want to talk about Southeast Asia, we have to probably cannot rule out these effects and impacts of the international trades, because that actually has an effect on sustainability. It's not just environment, food, water, soil, but also globalization. That has actually, I think right now is number one impact, and has an effect on farmers' decision to conserve or preserve the land or environment. Because if they're not economically sustained, they will not help us to preserve or conserve the environments, the resources. You know what I mean? Yeah. Thank you very much. Very much, Dr. Skuan. We have around 25 minutes for open discussion, but first I'd like to invite the panelists again to have some thoughts on the... Okay, sure. So if anyone from the floor has some questions, comments, thoughts, please.
Okay, good morning. John Dorr from Australia. Thank you. It's great to see the book finally completed. I remember the discussions between you all. I've never met Jeremy, but when this was sort of getting underway, and the way you've actually brought together and reflected on some of your earlier scholarship, I think is a very interesting process for us to read, and I'm sure it was a very interesting process for you to go through. There was a slide way back earlier, Deepak, where you listed 4 traits, if you like, of processes that you believe are important to enable sort of interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. They're the ones. My question is, given that the challenges that are inherent in reflecting on the Nexus are in every society at different levels, and so there's got to be some sort of social process for us to assist societal decision making rather than just academically reflect on it. My question is, are there 1 or 2 examples that any of you could provide of where you think it has been a decent social process that has displayed those characteristics? Was the Nepal Dams and Development Dialogue after the World Commission on Dams, was that one? Again, you're all involved in many different places. So I'm really interested in us finding the good processes and being encouraged by them and seeing what we can draw from them. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Carl and Deepak, for your presentations, and congratulations on the book. I was attracted to what Deepak earlier said about this whole process of hijacking. It happens as well, for instance, in gender and development studies, where I'm involved in issues of empowerment, for instance. The word empowerment has been actually very much hijacked in many ways. But you mentioned, for instance, two things. Carl, I think you mentioned water rights. Hasn't this been repeatedly hijacked by, let's say, efforts to privatize water as being a right to water? Second, that issue of transdisciplinarity. Isn't that something that the integrated water resource management paradigm has actually already accommodated? And I think there are already lessons learned from IWRM in their efforts at transdisciplinarity. Would not the idea of triangulation be a more worthwhile and workable idea with respect to people coming from different disciplines coming together to look for solutions? So that's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question. So you originate the idea of this nexus with the World Economic Forum, but ideational scholarship kind of looks at ideas from their theoretical underpinnings. And if I understand the World Economic Forum correctly, is that they do have like a research arm. What are the theoretical underpinnings of the nexus that the World Economic Forum kind of put forward? And that's just my first question for now.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I look very much forward to reading the book. And I was just wondering, when you talk about the big point that you make is the importance of democratizing the nexus. And I'd just like to get a bit more insights on how this can be done. Like, how can you democratize the nexus when democracy does not exist in a certain country? So how can you focus on that nexus without focusing on the political system? And how can you mentioned a bit of the importance of geopolitics in a bit of a critical way at the beginning of the presentation. But can critical geopolitics not help us, in a way, democratize the nexus? And can actually the nexus be useful at all for democracy or not? I just have a bit of difficulty in thinking of the nexus in the silo of the political system.
Carl being also from Australia, I work in Murray-Darling Basin, so deal with these issues of balancing competing values as a practitioner. The comments made through the book around transdisciplinarity, the need to bring values and concepts of ethics and justice to the table, and to be actively thinking about governance that's more participatory and all-encompassing are all, I think, very well-made points. Particularly our experience is that in a rapidly changing world, the most difficult problems we face are when change brings a challenge to an individual or community's values, and they have difficulty reconciling that in a rapidly changing world. I suppose what I was reflecting upon when you talked is these are all the right approaches and thoughts, but I'm not sure they resolve our underlying problem, which is that we ultimately have a tragedy of the commons, that the process of development is outpacing both our societal and environmental capacity to adapt, and for that adaptation to then be reconciled to values at a community level. And so some form of leadership is then needed to reconcile the tragedy. And I think some of the questions that we are struggling with is what needs to be decided, and there's no singularity in that decision making. There are lots of decisions that need to be made, and at what scale should they be made, and concepts such as subsidiarity, devolving decision making as far as possible. Who gets to decide, and finally, how should those decisions be made on what information? And I think what we struggle to do is to understand, we work at a national scale, but we impact individuals. I was very taken by the comments on small-scale farming. The small-scale farmer feels an impact. The impact doesn't reconcile with their lived experience or their values, but a decision still needs to be made. How are they involved in that process? And if change is required, how do they get to participate, but at the same time recognise the need to both shift their perceptions and values to accommodate a changing world?
Lots of questions here, very interesting. But let me begin with Nishi. I think you raised three very interesting points here. And the first one about solving real world problems. How does one sharpen the approaches? I don't think we have a solution as such. So I can only share my confusions right now. And the entry points, that you discussed. What are the entry points? I see three very distinct places of entry point for the Nexus. One is obviously the sector. Are you coming from water, energy, food, transport, whatever? Okay. And the other is discipline. We talked about it. Are you an economist or an engineer or a political scientist, an anthropologist, whatever? So these are quite obvious. But what is really also interesting is scale. So it's sector, discipline, and scale. Okay? And so when you, and this was also raised by Dr. Khan, when you see the problem from what some of us call a toad's eye approach from the bottom, it looks very different than when you see the problem from an eagle eye perspective. Okay? Both are needed, it's not to deny one or the other. But just too often we notice that there is, especially the larger, bigger institutions, once you move up from the family scale institutions and the village, small, whatever scale, you find out that the silofication gets more and more rigid. You have far bigger expertise coming in, and expertise does demand, very, very strong silo kind of work, and less of a cross silo work. But one way is to certainly begin to see where the problem was defined. Was it defined from a very high eagle eye perch, or was it defined from a toad's eye perch? Now, this also brings immediately into the question, mainstreaming social science that was raised. Social sciences and policy making has been hijacked by one kind of economics, not even the other kinds of economics, let alone the other social sciences. So, in water, for instance, it's been civil engineering and market economics. That's been sort of the dominant thing. So, anthropologists and others have been, coming in, muscling in there to talk about the voices of those who are going to be displaced and so on and so forth. There has not been a solution, but some places have tried to bring about good solutions. And one of the questions asked was, for instance, John, you asked this, what process allows this kind of interdisciplinarity? in Nepal, yeah, we started quite well, but right now, we are heading so far backwards. Right now, the big fight in Nepal is some other issue. It's one of the most draconian anti-press laws that's actually being passed right now. So there is a fine of 10 million rupees if you write a story that the government doesn't like. Yeah, it's going to be passed, the law.
You're in trouble?
We'll all be in trouble, so it doesn't matter. All my friends will be in jail, so we'll have a good time there, I guess. It doesn't matter. It won't work in the end. All kinds of dictatorships have tried doing that, but it'll lead to a lot of grief. But the place where it has worked, one good example that I like to cite is the cleanup of the Mekong. Now, culture theory explains this quite well. But what happened in the Mekong, unlike other places, now I argue that if Mekong could be cleaned up, any river in the world can be cleaned up, because Mekong was the sewer of Europe, all the industrial thing. It all happened because of two things. One was that they took a non-binding resolution, which we instinctively don't like. What good is a non-binding resolution? But it was a moral commitment at the highest level of all the 6 Mekong countries to get rid of 15 of the worst pollutants, and B, something that people laughed at that time, to get the salmon back on the Rhine. Salmon back on the Rhine, come on. But then they said, this will not be done at the highest level. It will be done at the lowest unit of government, the cantons and the landers. And so suddenly, in the cantons and landers, working with businesses, working with civic movements, working with trade unions and so on, they managed to solve it ahead of time. And now they have the salmon back on the Rhine. Because that nexus took place as at the lowest unit of governance that was possible. So this is one of the ways of going about. Now, there were the question of this politics of globalization that you asked is very interesting. Carl and I were talking about it on the way here. I think one of the things that we have not yet been serious enough globally is that globalization is in real trouble now. Mr. Trump and everything that's going on, America first, every other country first, every other group first. The globalization has really, interestingly, it was always opposed by the environmentalists. Now what has happened is we all environmentalists find out that with Mr. Trump on the other side, dismantling globalization so fast, we're suddenly finding out that, wait a minute, there are good things about globalization that we need to preserve, like climate change treaty and everything else. So we are at a very, very difficult time here, which is where we feel that probably this Nexus approach allows us some more avenue of exploring possibilities, that it opens up a few more avenues of exploration and maybe a few more avenues of, the fights that we have to deal with and defining our fights in the days ahead. And, the question of hijacking that, we got into, this has been bothering some of us for a very, very long time. In fact, that's my next book, of when democracies go bad. That's tentative so far. But the idea that, things get hijacked, even the best of ideas. All of development since the 1950s has been hijacked by one powerful group or the other. So the question to my mind comes back to something else. We've been fighting for democracy. People like us have gone on the streets and even gone to jail for a while. But the issue is, are we really talking about the procedures of democracy? Or are we talking about something much more fundamental, which is accountability? And right now it seems accountability has taken a backstage to the trappings of democracy. However much democracy is really about who can spend more money. In Nepal's case, the last election that we had, two of the most, I would say, quite well respected among the communists. We have a 2/3 majority communist government right now. But two of the most respected among them did not take the ticket offered to fight election by their own party, the Communist Party, because they came out with public statements saying, we don't have the money to offer the party for that ticket. So even within a Communist Party, forget the other parties that raise money from big corporations and all, even within a Communist Party, fighting an election was so expensive that very decent communist leaders could not fight elections because they could not give their party the kind of money that was required to fight the elections. So we're coming into some very, very serious questions, I think. And here we come back to Carl's point that there's going to be lots of decisions, but the most interesting decisions are going to be some of the decisions that some of us individually will have to take, and to take from perspectives of what we addressed on ethics and value. Because ethics and values have been there but have not been brought to salience, and we think that the Nexus debate really brings that to the foreground. We cannot avoid talking about the ethics of this, that, or the other action that we take. And this will be not just individual but also collective. And the question is at what scale collective do we really address this kind of issue? So this is where I think the Nexus opens up the debate, or as I like to put it, gets me out of that psychological straitjacket that I am tied into. At least I have some elbow room to fight.
How can I follow with that? I mean, my answer is essentially we need people like Deepak. But what I mean by that is something more fundamental, like holistic thinking people that actually see the connections is very important. But whether it's about democratic process or democratic space, I'll discuss it in more detail in a second, but just I increasingly think that when we talk about the need for expertise, we need to think about the role of public intellectuals a lot more. So people who can comment on society, but not just specialize in their own particular discipline of academia or their own issue that they work within civil society, but people that can actually see connections, talk publicly, lead when necessary, or suggest and form opinions. I won't go through point by point because I think we've perhaps covered quite a few, but one of the themes I think is like how to make what we're doing usable. I feel that we've kind of touched on it already. To me, actually, so one thing first with what John said, kind of hinting that writing the book has been a process. And actually, I think the process has continued a lot since this book has been ready for press, including a journey with a number of people in this room, like with Han thinking about different types of ontologies, with Oropan working with seriously thinking about how we teach transdisciplinary research and how we do transdisciplinary research. So this is, I think it's a continual journey. I actually feel somewhat optimistic that things are moving along. Similar working with SEI and Summernet, like the approach of co-producing knowledge has been really important to my thinking about what researchers could do. So I think it's like there's no really easy answer, just like an ongoing process. But I think one of the things I've become increasingly interested in is like usable knowledge that's kind of academically rigorous, but at the same time can be translated into action. And I think this is what transdisciplinary approaches can do. I think this is also the type of knowledge that public intellectuals produce as well. Like knowledge that kind of has some conceptual underpinning, but at the same time is made relevant to society. I'll talk on a couple of key points. I think I'll come back to Take's point a minute about usable knowledge when I talk about transdisciplinary approaches. Ajahn Subraman was, I think, really insightful that we shouldn't forget the role of economics. And I think that if I was to position the book and what we do, I think it's mainly political ecology. And so actually political ecology comes from political economy with an ecological term in it. And so in a political economic perspective, we see that economy, like trade, does not just fall from the sky, it doesn't just happen, it's actively produced. So governments create agreements, or like researchers, like we are also a part of this, the way that we teach students, the way that we do research. But then what that also implies is that there's actually values embedded within trade. That trade is not a neutral thing of buying and selling, but it actually involves certain commitments as to what type of trade that we take place. So the rules of trade are important. Are they leaning towards sustainability, or are they leaning towards rapid economic growth that we expect as sustainability? I think, so I don't know the specific cases for jury on farming, but one of the insights of political ecology that might be worth thinking about is why do certain farmers end up on land that is so readily degraded that it has to kind of be put to the point where it is in such intensive use that it becomes degraded? So in a place like Cambodia, for example, there's been this very, very extensive land grab that has taken a lot of the best land and given it to these very large concessions. So if you visited individual smallholder farmers, it might look that they have little land with low quality, but to understand why they have that land, we need to see the bigger picture of how they've been put onto certain land and excluded from others. So I don't really have a direct answer on this one, apart from to see trade in the broader context of other political processes that allocate resources like land, but then also maybe there might be an issue of access to water or access to other resources that could help sustain the land. So all of these relate to political processes. And then that can be domestically, but it also becomes embedded in international trade as well. So what are the international trade rules? I guess from my work, so I'm learning from so many people in this room, my work with Kake is to see the historical roots of East Asian trade. That East Asianism was created through a number of national and international processes that have created the way that industrialization folded out across the region. But John's challenge, I think, more than question, like challenge of can we find examples where we can see nexusing starting to happen. Not 100% successful, but hints of what is possible. With support from Samanet, with SEI, I was lucky enough to work with Ajahn Ganapwan Manarop in Thani University, where we were looking at how to deal with conflicts around the Ras Es Salai Dam 20 years down the road. And the approach was a co-production of knowledge approach about trying to find how could we find agreement, a shared understanding of knowledge as a basis for making decisions going forward. And it ranged in ambition from, at one level, can there be a discussion about how the dam might continue to exist with a social movement that has long challenged it. And there seems to be some potential for discussion about a coexistence within certain bounds. So there was an educational tourism program that was started. There was a collaboration between the state and the community. But on the other hand, dealing with historical land allocation cannot be dealt with. But I think the co-production of knowledge approach or transdisciplinary approach kind of hinted at what was possible under certain conditions.
Did that include the People's EIA process?
It built on that. So I think that this is the historical part is also really important to understand how we got to the point of enough trust to be built to have a discussion about thinking about what should be the future of that particular irrigation dam. It came from other exercises before. But then I think it goes to what Carl's point about why is it, like how to deal with when values become divergent, and what needs to be done in a sense to continue the way, not when change happens and things have to change, values have to change. I think, again, my transdisciplinary approaches have to be the way to really reflexively think about your values. Nobody wants to be told what to do. Being told what to do makes us stubborn, I think, as humans. But there's this kind of, I think in public policy, I think you'll be well aware of it, that you've got behaviour and then you've got values. So you can change people's behaviour through policy, economic policy. I will charge you $10 every time you bring your car into the centre of the city. It might make you drive less, but it may not change your value as to why you do not drive that day. Similar with plastic bags here. So I think that the sort of more deeper question, like why do we keep on working against that interest? In Bangkok over December and January, it was heavily polluted in the air, and we had all this information about how bad it was for our health. And yet, many of us, including myself, weren't fundamentally changing our behaviour by not riding a motorbike to work. Like, that sort of thing, like how do you link what we do to the information that we receive has to fundamentally be thought about. And maybe in the case of Nexus issues, where we're working with farmers, fishers, but also people in urban areas, it has to be a more intensive interaction thinking about these things. Frank's question on the fact that I think it's actually related to Ajahn Supuan's sort of thinking on international trade. So I think Frank would not be surprised actually. The foundation of the WEF approach, I think, is basically a combination of institutionalism or like new economic institutionalism with neoliberal economics. So like a lot of emphasis on commodifying resources as the most efficient way to allocate them, but combined with understanding, the World Economic Forum is institutions coming together, so it recognizes that neoliberal economics does not take place in a vacuum. It has institutions that governs it, and that's why the World Economic Forum, I think, exists. Last one, maybe a really fundamental question, democratizing the Nexus in a context where at least representational democracy is rather limited. I think Deepak kind of addresses this already, but I've been teaching at Chula for almost 10 years now. Time slips by very happily, in a sense. And I sort of puzzle over this a bit as well, but there can be some sort of framing of the region as, oh, there's no democracy at all. And yet people still find spaces. Right? People find spaces to challenge decisions, to create new agendas. It's not like there's no circulation of critical information. There can be discussions. So, for example, a recent paper that I've been doing with an ex-student in Myanmar has looked at hybrid public spheres, in the sense of hybrid democracies. It's not a perfect democracy, but neither is it totally an authoritarian state. And so similarly, for me, I think linking public intellectuals to how they can fulfill the role in linking things together, that also means there has to be a discussion among society at large, which means the circulation of discussion through mass media, through social media, and so on. That still happens. So I think it's not a question. I think for me it's not so, we're not black and white. I hope that the book makes clear that we do want to engage in political systems. It's the very core of understanding this sort of Nexus approach. But then it's also sort of not black and white as to how to understand them, that spaces can be created, but not without many times great risk for certain people, because political systems are also about power, and many of the sort of hottest environmental rights issues, people disappear, people die in the region. So the sort of creation of those spaces is not just, we have a privilege in a certain sense of being able to discuss in an academic institution these issues, but there are many more frontline positions where the space is really created.
I'll play a few more minutes if anyone has burning thoughts, questions.
Pichai, independent development specialist. I was just curious, since we are now sitting in Chulalongkorn, I know you're not Chula represented by agriculture faculty or whatever school. Then I know you have an environment research institute, energy research institute, right? Water, In other words, I have come across in my interactions with Chula faculty all these different disciplines, and each sometimes are doing something on the Nexus, right? Has there been any attempt to integrate? You want to start something doable, start on your own, home ground. You're not getting people from like Ajahn Sucharit or Ajahn Pongsa in water, Ajahn Supawan in agriculture, and somebody from the energy side, to sit down and work something out together. And would that be feasible or doable?
Thank you for that question. So, the first thing I have to extend is a genuinely sincere appreciation to Ajahn Supawan for joining us today. I reached out across the university trying to bring people into a genuine interdisciplinary discussion, and it's challenging. I think it's really challenging to bring people together to discuss in an interdisciplinary sense. We have wonderful researchers at university, very open-minded, really engaged, but I think there maybe it's just some inertia flinging us into different corners. People are busy, we have our own disciplines, our own ways that we are recognized as valuable or not. This afternoon, maybe something I have a bit more optimism for, some of the graduate students from our program are organizing a similar event to present graduate research. And again, they've been reaching out to students from across the university and kind of appreciating the challenges of bringing students together. But I do feel there's a little bit more of a discussion at least. Of course, some academics like Ajahn Surajai have really pushed the university to talk about these things. So maybe step by step. I hope that Ajahn Supawan will come back again if we invite her again. But maybe one by one we can start having a more interdisciplinary discussion. But I think it's a really important point. We can't even do it within one university.
This, I think, this is a very important question you raised. And again, there is no easy answer. But I want to just highlight two areas. My question is, and has been since writing this book and continuing, where is the focal point of where Nexus can be practiced? Okay. And on the government side, I am witness to a great Nexus point that has been a total failure. I can mention the Water and Energy Commission in Nepal. It's been set up, it was set up about 30 years ago, and it's very valuable, in the sense that you have the permanent secretaries of 12 ministries: water, food, energy, finance, foreign affairs, all of them there. And you would have thought that that would be the point where these issues, as they impinge on, let's say, a water decision, impinges on foreign relations with India, with farmer rights on food production and finance ministry and so on, you would have thought that's where it would work. Now, I chaired this as a minister also, and I realized how impossibly badly it had been, not just hijacked, actually completely destroyed. There's a saying in public administration that once you create a bureaucracy, you can't really kill it, you can strangle it. And the best way to strangle it is to keep the most incompetent guy as the head of it. That's what's been done in the last 30 years to this very, very valuable institution. I got involved in 2016 with a similar institution in Myanmar, the National Water Resource Committee, under the Vice President. I don't know how it is functioning. They had institutional structures better than those in Nepal, but I don't know, I'm out of touch, I don't know where it's going. So my question is, within governments you can see how a good Nexus point can be so badly destroyed. There are three other places. One is obviously university. But the university promotion system is so bad that you're only promoting people who contribute to their own narrow disciplines and not on interdisciplinary work. In American universities, I've seen that professors start doing interdisciplinary and all this kind of work only after they get full tenure and can't be thrown out. But before that, they're doing very narrow stuff to get the promotion. But then by that time, they're just too old to do really good in Nexus work. Now, that's where the universities are problems. But two areas of promise actually we found out, and this is more for activists to do the Nexus. One is journalism. Because journalists, whether they like it or not, are not experts on anything, and they have to deal with just about everything that comes up. So if there is a water project that's under conflict, you can really enter that area through journalism and address it through energy, economics, anthropology, you mentioned it. You can really do it. And the other strange thing I have found is political parties, bad as they are. If you can find the kind of right people there at that just below the top is useless, the next rank, who are aspiring to get to the top and who want to make a name for themselves, you catch them and then pump them with all these Nexus interdisciplinary questions. There's a hope, and I have found some successes where these issues get salience. They may not be probably still interest, but the point is at least they come into salience. So these are the places where I see some scope for Nexus.
Okay, so no more questions. In the interest of time, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the book launch, especially our distinguished panelists for giving us the overview of the book, the two discussants giving some very interesting thoughts on the book, The Water, Food, Energy, Nexus. So at last, I think this book is a very important call as well towards adopting a critical stance towards the concept of Nexus itself, because it's actually we see this, the concept of Nexus as a kind of discourse as well, a narrative that needs to be looked at more critically and see whether this discourse is there to serve someone. And I think this can be linked quite well with the concept of global distributive justice, where we not look at it as like the most minimalist sense, but also a more egalitarian approach where we look at the structure and how we could improve the structure and institution itself so that it could be more equal in distributing system of resources. And also when we look at the book, I think it's also important literature in environmental ethics itself, where we look at like the values justice embedded in water, food, and the Nexus. And we looked, I think, more closely whether we as humans are capable or could or should have a moral relationship with non-human agents as well. And I think this serves as a very interesting takeaways, and that can be explored further. So if you're interested in the book, the Political Science Library also carries them, and here's the call about how you can obtain this for the library or for yourself later. Thank you very much for coming to the book launch, and have a nice day.